The rain over Manhattan smelled like copper and gasoline, and Elena Marchetti hated that she still noticed things like that. Small, useless details her mind clung to instead of the one thing that mattered. Her son was not beside her anymore. She had turned her back for 4 minutes. 4 minutes at the pharmacy counter, 4 minutes reading a label on a bottle of children's fever medicine, and when she turned around, Matteo was gone from the bench where she'd told him to wait. She found him 2 blocks away, in front of a black car longer than her apartment, surrounded by men in dark suits who looked like they'd been carved out of granite. And in the centre of them, crouched to eye level with a 5-year-old boy, was a man Elena had spent 5 years trying to forget. Damien Rossi. He was showing Matteo something in his palm, a silver lighter catching the streetlight, and Matteo was laughing, the unguarded laugh of a child who didn't know yet that the world could be a knife. "Matteo," Elena's voice cracked down the middle of the word. "Get away from him." Damien looked up. 5 years had sharpened him the way a blade is sharpened, thinner at the edges, harder at the core, more dangerous for being more refined. His eyes found her face, and something in them went absolutely still, the stillness of a man standing at the edge of a cliff he'd spent years convincing himself didn't exist. Elena. Just her name. He said it like a diagnosis. "Give me my son." She stepped forward, and 2 of his men shifted, and Damien raised one hand, barely, and they stopped as if he'd shot them. "Our son," Damien said quietly. The words hit her like the rain, cold and everywhere at once. "You don't get to say that." "I don't." And that was when it happened. The thing none of his men had ever seen, the thing that would be repeated in whispered legend through every family in the 5 boroughs for years afterward. Damien Rossi, the man who had never raised his voice in a negotiation, who had once watched a man burn alive without blinking, crossed the space between himself and Elena Marchetti and gripped her shoulder hard enough to bruise. His voice, when it came, was shaking. 4 years, 11 months, and 16 days. His jaw worked like the words were being pulled out of him with pliers. "I counted every single one of them, Elena. Every morning I woke up in that penthouse and counted how many days it had been since you disappeared with something that belonged to both of us. And you're standing here telling me I don't get to call him my son?" The rain kept falling. His men stared at the pavement, at the car, at anything but their boss's face, because a man like Damien Rossi wasn't supposed to have a face like that. Stripped down, raw, 5 years of carefully constructed control cracking open in the middle of a public sidewalk. Elena's whole body was shaking too, but for a different reason. "You left." "I didn't leave. You left." His grip loosened, but he didn't let go. "I came home, and you were gone. No note, no number, nothing but that." He nodded toward her throat, and she realized with a jolt that she was still wearing it. The thin gold chain with the small cross pendant, the one he'd given her the night before everything fell apart. She'd told herself 100 times she kept it out of habit. She'd never believed the lie. "You know why I left," she whispered. "I know what you were told." His eyes dropped to Matteo, who was watching the 2 adults with the confused patience of a child who understood, without understanding, that something enormous was happening above his head. "I know someone convinced you I was going to use him, trade him, make him a chip on a table. Damien's throat moved. I would have burned down the whole East Coast before I let anyone put a hand on that boy, Elena. I would have burned down the world. How am I supposed to believe that? You don't have to believe it tonight. Damien finally released her shoulder and stepped back. The first retreat she had ever seen him make in 5 years of knowing this man, in the year she had loved him before that. But you're not disappearing again. Not with him. I've lost 4 years, 11 months, and 16 days of watching my son grow up. I am done losing time, Elena. I don't care what it costs. Behind him, thunder cracked over the river, and Matteo, oblivious to threats and empires and broken hearts, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mama, is that man my papa?" Elena closed her eyes. Somewhere behind them, in the dark, a car door had opened and closed too quietly. A small sound that meant nothing to anyone standing on that sidewalk that night, but would mean everything in the weeks to come. 5 years earlier, before the rooftop garden had died, and before Elena's name became something Damien couldn't say out loud without his chest caving in, there had been a summer. He remembered it in pieces, the way a man remembers the last good year before a war. Elena, barefoot, on the penthouse terrace, with paint under her fingernails because she'd insisted on repainting the herb boxes herself, refusing his staff's help, laughing at him when he stood in the doorway in the $3,000 suit, looking personally offended that dirt existed in his building. He remembered her stealing his shirts and never giving them back. He remembered the night he'd put the gold chain around her neck, and she'd cried, actual tears, and told him nobody had ever given her something that wasn't a means to an end. He had believed then that he was the exception to every rule he'd built his life on, that a man who commanded fear could also be loved without condition. He had been wrong about many things. He had not been wrong about that. Now, in the penthouse that still smelled faintly of her perfume, even though 5 years should have erased it, Damien opened the top drawer of his nightstand the way he did every night, without fail, the way other men said prayers. Inside lay a small velvet box. Inside the box, a necklace. Not the one Elena wore, but its twin, the one he'd bought for himself in secret, half joking, telling her a man needed something to remind him what he was fighting for. He had never taken it off until the day she vanished. Then he had put it away, because wearing it felt like wearing a wound. Tonight, for the first time in 4 years, 11 months and 16 days, he took it out and put it back around his neck. His consigliere, Vincent, found him like that an hour later, standing at the window with the city spread out beneath him like a field of dying stars, the chain glinting against his collar. "You saw them," Vincent said. It wasn't a question. "I saw my son." Damien didn't turn around. "He has her eyes, and my mother's chin. God help him." Damien. Vincent's voice carried the particular caution of a man who had known his boss since they were both 19 and had learned, over 2 decades, exactly when caution was warranted. "You understand what this means for the family? A child. An heir the other families didn't know existed. The Volkoffs will hear about this within a week. The Calabrettis sooner. Let them hear." "You're not thinking clearly. I have thought of nothing else for 5 years, Vincent." Now he did turn, and whatever was in his face made even Vincent, a man who had buried 3 brothers and never flinched, take an involuntary step back. "I have sat in this apartment, counting days like a lunatic. I have had men searching 4 continents for a woman who didn't want to be found. and every single report that came back empty nearly put a bullet in my head. Don't tell me I'm not thinking clearly. I am the only man in this city who has been thinking clearly since the day she left, because I am the only one who never stopped." Vincent said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, "What do you want to do?" "I want to bring them home." Damien's hand rose unconsciously to touch the necklace at his throat. "Whatever it costs, whoever objects, I want my son to grow up knowing his own name, and I want—" He stopped. Even now, even after everything, some words still cost him too much to say freely. "You want her," Vincent finished, gently, the way only a man who'd watched his friend fall apart in private for half a decade could say it. Damien didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence in that room said more than any confession, and outside the window the city glittered on, indifferent, the way it always had, the way it always would, no matter how many men, like Damien Rossi, broke themselves quietly against its glass. Elena had built her life the way a person builds a shelter in a flood, quickly, out of whatever was at hand, never quite trusting it would hold. 3 years in Ohio, under a name that wasn't hers. 2 years after that in Philadelphia, closer to danger than she liked, but closer, too, to the network of women who had helped her disappear the first time. Women who owed favors to the Marchetti name. A name Elena had spent her whole life trying to escape, long before Damien Rossi ever entered it. She worked as a bookkeeper for a small chain of Italian restaurants, cash under the table, no last name on any lease. Matteo went to a public school 3 train stops away, so that even the neighbors on her block couldn't connect the boy's face to the woman who picked him up every day at 3:15. She had taught him, since he could talk, never to say where they lived to strangers, never to mention his mother's job, never, and this was the rule that broke her heart every time she repeated it, never to say his father's name. Because he didn't have one. She had told herself over and over that she left to protect him, that the night she overheard 2 of Damien's men discussing the boy as leverage in a negotiation with the Calabretti family, discussing him the way men discuss a chess piece, not a child, was proof enough that the empire Damien ruled would eventually swallow her son whole, the way it swallowed everything. She had not stayed to ask Damien if it was true. She had grabbed Matteo, then 8 months old, and disappeared into the kind of life where women learn not to sleep too deeply. But some nights, in the small apartment with its water-stained ceiling, she let herself remember the year before that, the year she had actually let herself love him, back before she understood exactly what loving Damien Rossi would cost. She remembered him carrying her up 4 flights of stairs once, laughing when the elevator broke, complaining the entire way that a boss of his standing shouldn't have to climb stairs like a peasant, and then kissing her breathless at the top, like it was the greatest victory of his life. She remembered him sitting up with her at 3 in the morning while she cried over a father who'd never once said he was proud of her, and Damien, cold, terrifying Damien Rossi, had simply held her and said nothing, because for once in his life he understood that some grief doesn't need fixing, only witnessing. She missed that man. She had spent 5 years telling herself she didn't, and every single time had been a lie. Now he was back in her life, standing in the rain with his voice shaking and a necklace at his throat that she recognized instantly. And Elena understood, with the particular dread of a woman watching a levee finally give way, that she was no longer choosing whether to let him back in. He had already found the crack, and water, given a crack, always finds its way home. That night, after she'd finally gotten Matteo to sleep in the small bed by the window, she sat at the kitchen table of the safe house Damien's men had moved them into, because of course she had gone with him. What choice did she have when he'd made it clear he would tear the city apart looking for them otherwise, and stared at the phone Vincent had handed her. "For emergencies," he'd said. "Damien's number is the only one programmed in." She didn't call it. She held it in both hands like something that might detonate, and outside the window, far below, she could just make out a black car parked at the curb, engine idling, someone inside it keeping watch over a woman who had spent 5 years running from the very idea of being watched. She should have felt trapped. She felt, for the first time in 5 years, something disturbingly close to safe. The penthouse hadn't changed. That was the first thing Elena noticed when Damien's men brought her and Matteo up in the private elevator 3 days later. The same charcoal walls, the same wall of glass overlooking the river, the same smell of leather and cedar, and something underneath it that she had never been able to name except as him. What had changed was the third bedroom. It had been an office once, all steel and glass, and a desk Damien used for calls he didn't want overheard. Now it held a small bed shaped like a race car, shelves of picture books still smelling faintly of the store, a nightlight shaped like a lighthouse plugged into the wall beside the window. "You did this," Elena said. It wasn't an accusation. It came out smaller than she meant it to. "I did it 4 years ago." Damien stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching Matteo run his fingers along the spines of the books, with the particular wonder of a child encountering more toys than he'd ever owned at once. "And I've been updating it every year since, on his birthday. I didn't know if I'd ever get to bring him here. I did it anyway." Elena's throat tightened. "Why?" "Because hope is a stupid, stubborn thing, and I never learned how to kill it where he was concerned." He looked at her, and something in his expression made her look away first. "Same as you, apparently." She didn't answer that. She didn't trust herself to. Matteo, unaware of the weight in the room, turned around holding a picture book about race cars nearly as big as his torso. "Can we read this one?" "We can read whatever you want, mio piccolo." Damien's voice, when he spoke to his son, dropped into a register Elena had never heard from him before. Soft, careful. The voice of a man handling something he was terrified of breaking. He crossed the room and sat on the floor, an act so far beneath his usual dignity that Elena almost laughed, except her chest was too tight for laughter. Matteo climbed into his lap without hesitation, the way children do when some instinct tells them a stranger is safe, and Damien's arms came around him like he'd been waiting 5 years for exactly this weight to settle against his chest. Because he had. Elena stood in the doorway and watched the two of them, father and son, dark heads bent together over a picture book, and felt something crack open in her ribs that she'd spent 5 years welding shut. "He has your laugh," she said quietly, before she could stop herself. Damien looked up. "He has your stubbornness. He wouldn't put his shoes on this morning until I let him choose which sock went first. Left, apparently. Always left." "That's..." Elena's voice caught. "That's my father's thing. Left sock first. I didn't even know I'd passed that down." "Blood does what it wants," Damien said, and something passed between them in that sentence that had nothing to do with socks. The spectre of every unspoken thing about family and inheritance and the things you cannot choose to give your children, only hope they survive. Later, after Matteo had fallen asleep mid-sentence over the race car book and been carried to his new bed by a father who moved like the boy was made of glass, Elena found herself alone with Damien on the terrace, the same terrace where she'd once painted herb boxes barefoot in a summer that felt like another lifetime. "I'm not staying because I trust you," she said, watching the river instead of him. "I know. I'm staying because he's safer here than anywhere I could take him alone. And because you clearly aren't going to stop looking. And I am tired, Damien. I am so tired of running." "Then stop." He said it simply, without demand, without the possessive heat she half expected. "Just for tonight. Stop running. Sleep in a bed that isn't bolted to a wall you're ready to climb out of. We'll fight about everything else tomorrow." She almost smiled. Almost. "You always did know how to negotiate." "With everyone except you." His eyes found hers in the dark, and for a moment the 5 years fell away entirely, and they were simply two people standing on a terrace in the summer, before either of them had learned what the world could cost. "I have never once won an argument with you, Elena. I've simply learned to wait you out." "That's not winning." "No," he agreed, quiet, almost gentle. "It's something worse. It's hoping." The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them named out loud, because naming it would have made it real, and real things could be taken away. Elena woke each morning to the sound of Matteo's small feet running down the hallway toward the kitchen, where, impossibly, absurdly, Damian Rossi, feared across 3 states, stood at the stove in a white undershirt, making pancakes shaped like animals, because his son had requested a giraffe and refused to eat anything shaped like a square. "You could have staff do this," Elena said the third morning, leaning in the doorway with her coffee, watching him frown in fierce concentration at a pancake that was supposed to be a giraffe and looked more like a question mark with legs. Staff didn't miss 4 years of his breakfasts. Damien didn't look up from the pan. "I'm not delegating this one." She didn't have an answer for that, so she drank her coffee instead and let herself watch him. The sleeves pushed up, the forearms she remembered too well, the small furrow of concentration between his brows that hadn't changed in 5 years, even while everything else about him had hardened into something colder, sharper, more dangerous. He caught her looking. Neither of them said anything about it. That, too, became a kind of rhythm. There were rules, unspoken but rigid, that governed the strange domestic peace of the penthouse. Damien never entered her room without knocking, even to check on Matteo, even at 3 in the morning when the boy called out from a nightmare, and Elena beat him there by half a second every single time. Some instinct in her refusing to let him arrive first. Elena, in turn, never asked about the men who came and went through the private elevator at odd hours, never asked about the calls Damien took on the terrace with his voice dropped low and flat, the voice she remembered from before, the one that belonged to the boss and not the father. They were building something around a wound, both of them. Careful architecture meant to hold weight without ever pressing directly on the place that hurt. It held, mostly, until the evening Vincent arrived, unannounced, face grim in a way Elena had learned in only a week to recognize as trouble. "We have a problem," Vincent said, and his eyes flicked to Elena before returning to Damien, a look that asked, silently, whether she should hear this. "Say it," Damien said. "She stays." Elena felt something warm and unexpected bloom in her chest at that. Not gratitude, not quite, but something close to it, the strange relief of being included instead of shielded. "Nikolai Volkov knows about the boy," Vincent's voice was low. Word reached him 3 days ago. He's already making calls, testing which of our people might be persuaded to talk. And Damien, Vincent hesitated. There is chatter that someone inside the family has been feeding him information for months, before the boy. This isn't new. This is old. The kitchen went very quiet. Matteo at the table was oblivious, absorbed in stacking blocks into a tower that kept collapsing, laughing every time it fell. How long have you known there was a leak? Damien's voice had gone flat. Dangerous. The voice Elena remembered from the rare occasions business had bled into their old life together. Suspected, not known. Now I know. Vincent's jaw tightened. Someone close, Damien. Close enough to know things only a handful of people know. Damien's eyes moved, involuntarily, toward the hallway that led to the third bedroom, the one with the race car bed and the lighthouse nightlight, and Elena watched something in his face go cold and hard and utterly without mercy. The face, she realized with a shiver, of the man the entire underworld feared, the man she had almost forgotten lived inside the one who made giraffe pancakes. Find him, Damien said. Whoever it is. I don't care what it costs, Vincent. Find him before he finds a way to touch my son. Vincent nodded as closed and left as quietly as he'd come. Damien stood at the counter for a long moment after the door closed, hands braced against the marble, head bowed, and Elena, against every instinct that had kept her alive for 5 years, crossed the kitchen and put her hand on his back. He went still under her palm. We'll protect him, she said quietly. Both of us. Together. Damien turned, and the look on his face was one she had never seen there before. Not once in the year she'd loved him the first time. Something unguarded. Something that looked almost like fear, except it wasn't fear for himself. I already lost him once, he said, without ever knowing I had him to lose. I am not doing that again, Elena. Whatever comes for us, it comes through me first. Behind them, Matteo's tower of blocks collapsed again, and he laughed, bright and unknowing, and both of his parents turned toward the sound, like it was the only true north either of them had left. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way except for what it revealed when Elena stood in the hallway and watched her son learn to tie his shoes. Damien was crouched on the floor of the entryway, Matteo's small foot propped on his knee, the two of them bent so close together their foreheads nearly touched. Bunny ears, Damien was saying, patient in a way that still surprised her every time she witnessed it. You make 2 loops, see? And then they keep falling apart. Matteo's frustration was total and immediate, the particular fury of a 5-year-old encountering a task his fingers weren't ready for. They fall apart because you're rushing. Damien's voice was low, even, endlessly gentle. Rushing is for people who don't have someone waiting for them. You have me. I'm not going anywhere. So slow down. Elena stood in the doorway, coffee cooling in her hands, and felt the words land somewhere deep and undefended in her chest. I'm not going anywhere. He'd said it to a 5-year-old about shoelaces, and it had gutted her anyway, because 5 years ago, she'd been so certain those words would never apply to her, to either of them, that staying had been a language Damien Rossi simply didn't speak. She watched his hands, the same hands that, according to whispers she'd overheard even in her years of hiding, had ended lives without hesitation, guide their son's clumsy fingers through loop after loop with a patience that bordered on reverent. She watched Matteo's face light up when the bow finally held, watched Damien's answering smile, small and helplessly proud, the smile of a man discovering he was capable of a happiness he'd stopped believing in. And that was when he looked up and caught her watching. Neither of them spoke. The moment stretched, taut and silent, 5 years of distance compressed into the 3 seconds their eyes held. Eleanor felt tears rise before she could stop them. Not sadness exactly, or not only sadness, but something more complicated, grief and hope, tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate them. Grief for every one of these small moments that had already happened without her. Hope that she was finally being let back into the ones still to come. Damien didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His eyes said what his voice couldn't. I know. I feel it too. I don't know what to do with it either. Matteo, oblivious, jumped up and ran a lopsided victory lap around the entryway, shouting that he'd done it. He'd actually done it. And the spell broke. And Elena wiped her face quickly before her son could see. And Damien rose from the floor with the particular stiffness of a man who'd been crouched too long and was grateful for the excuse to look away. He's going to want to do it 100 more times now, Damien said, voice rough. Just so you know. Once he learns something he likes, he doesn't stop. Sounds familiar, Elena said, and it came out softer than she intended. Does it? Damien's eyes found hers again, and this time neither of them looked away first. I never stopped either, Elena. In case that wasn't clear from the 4 years, 11 months, and 16 days. It's fewer days now, she said, and it was meant to be light, deflecting, and it came out instead as something dangerously close to an invitation. 5 years, 1 week, 2 days, Damien said instantly, without having to think about it, the way a man recites the only prayer he still believes in. I'm still counting. I don't think I'll stop counting until you tell me to. She didn't tell him to. She wasn't ready to say what stopping the count would mean, what door it would open, how much of herself she'd have to hand back to a man who had already broken her heart once by omission, even if she was starting, in small and unwilling increments, to believe he hadn't meant to. That night, she stood in her doorway long after Matteo had fallen asleep and listened to Damien's footsteps pass down the hall toward his own room, slower than usual, pausing outside her door for 3 full seconds before continuing on. She didn't open the door, but she stood with her hand against the wood for a long time after his footsteps faded, feeling the wall as if she could feel him through it, and understood, with the specific dread of a woman watching herself fall, despite every warning system she'd built, that the distance between them was no longer 5 years. It was 5 feet. A hallway. A door she hadn't opened yet. And some nights, that was a more dangerous distance than any ocean. The invitation came from the Calabretti family, a gala at their Tribeca club, ostensibly to celebrate a business merger, actually, as everyone in the room understood, a chance for the city's 5 families to study Damian Rossi's newly surfaced heir and the woman who'd produced him. You don't have to come, Damien told her, adjusting his cufflinks in the bedroom mirror, while Elena stood behind him in a dress Vincent's assistant had procured with almost frightening speed. Deep red, sleeveless, the kind of dress that made a woman feel like a weapon and a target in equal measure. If I don't come, they'll say I'm hiding something. Elena met his eyes in the mirror. Or that you're hiding me. Either way, it makes Matteo look vulnerable. I'm coming.
Something flickered across Damien's face. Pride, maybe, or the particular ache of watching a woman he loved willingly step into danger because she understood the game better than most men who'd been born into it. The club was exactly the kind of place Elena remembered from her old life before she ran. All black marble and candlelight, and old money pretending it wasn't watching everyone else in the room. Conversation dimmed almost imperceptibly when Damien walked in with his hand at the small of Elena's back, the particular quiet of a room recalibrating around new information. It was the Calabretti's son, Marco, who made the first move. Not against Damien, who would have been suicide, but against the softer target, sidling up to Elena at the bar with the easy charm of a man who'd never once had to earn anything.
Elena Marchetti. He said her name like he was tasting it. Or is it Rossi now? Nobody's quite sure what to call the mother of an heir nobody knew existed. Elena is fine, she said, cool, practiced. 5 years of hiding having taught her exactly how to give nothing to a stranger fishing for weakness. Must be strange. Marco's eyes travelled, slow and deliberate, in a way that made her skin crawl. Disappearing for 5 years, and reappearing with a son who could reshape the entire balance of power in this city. Some men would call that leverage. I call it... He didn't get to finish. Damien appeared between them so quickly, Elena didn't see him cross the room, only felt the sudden shift of air, the way every conversation within 20 feet went dead silent. Marco? Damien's voice was pleasant. That was the terrifying part. How pleasant it was. You're standing very close to my wife. The word landed in the room like a dropped glass. Elena's breath caught. They weren't married. They'd never even discussed it. But the claim in his voice left no room for argument. No room for anyone in that club to imagine Elena Marchetti as anything other than absolutely, permanently spoken for. Marco's smile faltered. I didn't realize. Now you do. Damien didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I'd hate for a misunderstanding to become a mistake we both have to live with. Go find your father, Marco. Tell him I said hello. Marco left without another word, and the room's quiet dissolved back into careful, watchful conversation, and Damien turned to Elena with an expression that was equal parts fury and something rawer underneath it, something that looked almost like fear. I know I have no right, he said, low only for her. I know we haven't. I know what I said isn't. He stopped, jaw working. I couldn't stand it, watching him look at you like that. 5 years I've imagined every version of you happy with someone else, safe with someone else, and I told myself if that were true, I'd be glad, because at least you'd be safe. But watching it in front of me. His hand found her wrist, not gripping, just resting there, warm and unsteady. I'm not glad, Elena. I'm the furthest thing from glad. I don't think I have it in me to watch another man look at you like you're available. Elena's heart was pounding in a way that had nothing to do with Marco Calabretti and everything to do with the man in front of her, unravelling in real time in the middle of a room full of enemies. You called me your wife, she said quietly. I know. We're not married. I know that too. His eyes didn't leave hers, but I meant it the way I said it. Every part of it. I don't know how to say it smaller than that, and I'm done trying to. Across the room, cameras of a different kind, eyes belonging to the 5 families, calculating, filing away every detail, watched Damien Rossi hold a woman's wrist like it was the only solid thing left in a world made of knives, and understood, correctly, that whatever was between them was no longer a rumour to be tested. It was a fact to be reckoned with. 3 floors below the gala, in a service corridor that smelled of bleach and cigarette smoke, a man in a Calabretti uniform pressed a burner phone to his ear and spoke in a voice pitched low enough to vanish beneath the noise of the party above.
"They're calling her his wife now," the man said, in public, in front of the Calabrettis. On the other end, Nikolai Volkov's voice was unhurried, amused in the particular way of a man who enjoyed watching other men's foundations crack. "Sentiment," he said, "is the most reliable weapon ever built, better than any gun. A man in love makes mistakes a man alone in the world never would." "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing, yet." A pause, contemplative. "Keep watching. Keep listening. Rossi's guard is coming down around that woman and the boy, and every crack he opens is a door for us. When the moment is right, you'll know. I'll tell you." The line went dead. The man in the Calabretti uniform tucked the phone back into his jacket and returned to the party, refilling a champagne glass here, clearing a plate there. Invisible in the way only service staff ever truly are in rooms full of powerful people who've spent their whole lives learning not to see the help. He had been feeding information to Volkov for the better part of a year. Small things at first. Shipment schedules, meeting locations, the kind of intelligence that could be explained away as coincidence if it were ever traced. He told himself it was survival. Volkov had found something on him, something from before, something that would have gotten him killed by his own family if it surfaced, and the arrangement had simply been the lesser of 2 deaths. He told himself that every night, and every night it got a little easier to believe. Upstairs, unaware that the walls of his own celebration were listening, Damien danced with Elena for the first time in 5 years, one hand at the small of her back, the other holding hers with a formality that felt, absurdly, like the first time all over again. Careful, reverent, afraid to want something so badly in front of people who could smell weakness like blood in water. "You're staring," Elena murmured. "I'm memorizing." His voice was quiet, meant only for her. "In case this is the only time I get." That's a morbid thing to say at a party. "I've buried too many friends to believe safety is anything but borrowed time, Elena. I learned that lesson properly the day you disappeared. I don't intend to waste a single moment I have with you, pretending otherwise." She didn't answer. She rested her head briefly against his shoulder instead. And if anyone in that glittering room was watching closely enough, they might have seen something pass across Damien Rossi's face that looked, unmistakably, like a man finally exhaling after 5 years of holding his breath. But someone was watching. Someone always was. And somewhere in the building's foundations, a fault line that had been growing quietly for a year was about to become the thing that split their fragile peace wide open. The rain came back 3 nights later, hammering the penthouse windows in long grey sheets, and with it came the fever. Elena heard him first, the particular wrongness in a child's cry that every parent learns to recognize instantly, a pitch that cuts straight through sleep. She was in the hallway before she fully registered moving, and Damien was already there ahead of her, having beaten her by seconds this time, kneeling at Matteo's bedside with his hand pressed to the boy's forehead. "He's burning up," Damien said, voice tight with a fear Elena had never heard from him before. Not the cold calculation of business gone wrong, but the raw, helpless terror of a father who could face down armed men without flinching and still be undone entirely by 103 degrees on a 5-year-old. They worked together without discussing it, the way people do when instinct outpaces thought. Elena stripping Matteo down to his undershirt, while Damien ran for the medicine cabinet, both of them murmuring reassurances to a boy too miserable to be comforted by words alone. The house doctor arrived within 20 minutes, examined him, pronounced it a bad flu, nothing more, prescribed fluids and fever reducers and patience, and left them to the long night. They took turns, technically. In practice, neither of them left the room. Elena sat on one side of the bed, Damien on the other, both of them reaching to check Matteo's temperature every few minutes, with the particular obsessiveness of parents convinced that vigilance alone could hold sickness at bay. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, both their hands landed on his forehead at the same moment. Neither withdrew immediately. Their fingers brushed, then settled, overlapping, against their son's damp hair. And for a long moment, neither of them moved, caught in the strange intimacy of the accidental touch. 5 years of unspoken want compressed into the small space where their hands met. "He's cooler," Elena whispered. Unnecessary, an excuse to keep talking rather than acknowledge the current running between them. A little. Damien's voice was low, rough with exhaustion, and something else. His eyes lifted from Matteo's face to hers, and in the dim light of the lighthouse nightlight, 5 years fell away entirely. "Elena, don't." It came out breathless, not a refusal so much as a plea for time she didn't have. "I'm not asking for anything." His hand didn't move from where it rested beside hers on their son's forehead. "I just need to say it once, out loud, before I lose my nerve again. I have missed you every day for 5 years, in a way that made the empire, the money, the power, all of it, feel like ash in my mouth. I would trade every dollar I have ever made for 1 more year of you painting herb boxes on that terrace. I don't know how to stop feeling that, Elena. I've tried." Her chest ached with the effort of not closing the last inch of distance between their hands. "I've tried too," she admitted, barely audible. "I told myself I hated you. It was easier than admitting I still—" His phone rang. It shattered the moment like glass, and Damien's face changed instantly, the softness replaced by the flat, alert focus of a man whose life required him to answer every call as if it might be the one that mattered most. He glanced at the screen, and something in his jaw tightened. "Vincent," he said, already rising, "I have to take this." "Damien!" "I know." His eyes found hers one last time before he stepped into the hallway, and the look he gave her carried a promise neither of them had spoken aloud yet. "This isn't finished. I need you to know that. Whatever this call is, it doesn't end what almost happened here." He disappeared into the hallway, and Elena heard his voice drop into the low, clipped register of business, the words indistinct, but the tone unmistakable. Trouble, and not the small kind. She sat beside her sleeping son, her hands still resting where Damien's had been, and felt the fragile warmth of the last hour curdle slowly into dread. When Damien returned to the doorway 10 minutes later, his face had gone the colour of ash. "What is it?" Elena whispered, already standing. "The leak Vincent's been chasing." His voice was flat, controlled in the way that frightened her more than shouting would have. "We found him. He's Calabretti's staff. He's been feeding Volkov information for a year. Damien's eyes moved to Matteo, sleeping now, fever finally breaking. And 2 hours ago, he told Volkov exactly where this penthouse is. The next 72 hours moved like a held breath. Damien doubled security on every floor of the building, brought in men Elena had never seen before, hard-eyed and silent, positioned at every stairwell and elevator bank. Matteo, recovering from his fever, was not permitted outside the penthouse at all, a restriction he protested loudly and uncomprehendingly, too young to understand why his father's face had gone so grim, why his mother checked the locks on his window 3 times before bed. "I know this is frightening," Damien told Elena on the second night, both of them standing in his study while Vincent laid photographs across the desk, grainy surveillance images of men entering and exiting a warehouse on the East River, men Damien identified one by one as Volkov's known enforcers. "But frightened is better than dead. I need you to trust the process, even when it feels like a cage." "I know what a cage feels like, Damien. I spent 5 years building one around myself just to keep him safe." Elena's arms were crossed, not in anger, but in the particular self-protective posture of a woman braced against a blow she couldn't see coming. "Tell me the truth. How bad is this?" Damien exchanged a look with Vincent before answering, and that hesitation told her everything the words hadn't yet. "Volkov has wanted a foothold in this territory for a decade," Damien said finally. "He's never had leverage strong enough to force it. Now he has a location, and he knows about Matteo. And men like Volkov don't distinguish between a 5-year-old and a bargaining chip." His voice hardened. "But he has never had to face me with something to lose before. That changes the calculation. I will not let him within 100 yards of my son." "That's not an answer, Damien. That's a promise you can't guarantee." "No," he admitted, and something in his honesty frightened her more than false confidence would have. "It isn't, but it's the only one I have to give you, and I intend to spend everything I own making sure I keep it." That night, gunfire found the building for the first time. Not an assault, Vincent would later clarify, but a message. 3 shots fired into the lobby's reinforced glass from a passing car, enough to shatter nerves without shattering the barrier itself. Damien was in the stairwell before the echo faded, weapon in hand, moving with the terrible, fluid calm of a man who had done this before and would do it again without hesitation. Elena spent those minutes locked in Matteo's room, with her back against the door, one hand pressed over her son's mouth to keep his frightened cry from carrying, her heart slamming so hard she thought it might crack her ribs from the inside. When Damien returned 20 minutes later, blood on his knuckles that wasn't his own, his eyes found her through the cracked door, with a desperation she'd never seen in him before, not once. Not even the night at the pharmacy when he'd broken in front of his own men. "You're both safe," he said. And it wasn't a question. It was a man confirming a fact he needed to be true before he could breathe again. "We're safe." Elena's voice shook. "Damien, what happened?" "A message. Volkov wants us to know he can reach us. He's not attacking yet. He's negotiating through fear first, the way men like him always do." Damien crossed the room and knelt in front of her, and for a moment the boss disappeared entirely, replaced by a man who looked, in that instant, entirely undone. "I need you to understand something, Elena. If this escalates the way I think it will, I may have to make choices you won't like. Choices about how far I'm willing to go to protect you both." "I don't care how far you go. Elena's hand found his, blood and all. "I care that you come back, both of you, all three of us." Something in Damien's face cracked open at that. The particular vulnerability of a man being handed permission he never expected to receive, forgiveness for violence not yet committed, love offered without condition in the middle of the worst night either of them had faced since she'd walked back into his life. He didn't say anything. He simply pressed his forehead to hers, and for a long moment, in a hallway lit only by the frightened glow of a lighthouse nightlight bleeding through a cracked door, the war outside felt, briefly, survivable. It was Vincent in the end who let the secret slip, not out of carelessness, but because he assumed, wrongly, that Elena already knew. They were reviewing security logs in the study 3 days after the shooting, tension still thick in every room of the penthouse, when Vincent mentioned in passing the need to consolidate the trust accounts before Volkov's people start digging into anything financial that might be traced back to the boy's location. Elena went very still. What trust? Vincent glanced at Damien, and the look on Damien's face, caught, exposed, 5 years of careful concealment suddenly transparent, told her this was not information she'd been meant to have yet, or possibly ever. "Damien?" Her voice was quiet, dangerous in its quietness. "What trust is he talking about?"
Vincent excused himself with the practiced speed of a man who recognized a conversation he had no business witnessing, and the study door clicked shut, leaving Elena and Damien alone with a truth that had waited 5 years to surface. "Sit down," Damien said. "I don't want to sit down. I want you to tell me what trust fund my son has been living off of that I apparently didn't know about." Damien exhaled, and when he spoke, the words came slowly, each one costing him something. "The month after you disappeared, I hired a firm to find you. Not to bring you back, I want to be clear about that, though I understand if you don't believe me, but to make sure you were safe, to make sure you had what you needed." He met her eyes. "It took them 4 months. When they found you in Ohio, I didn't approach you. I understood by then what you must have believed about me. And I was afraid that if I showed up, you'd run again, farther, somewhere I'd never find you at all. So I did the only thing I could think of that wouldn't reveal me." "What did you do?" "I set up an account, anonymous, routed through 3 shell companies so it could never be traced to my name. Every month, money went in, enough to cover rent, groceries, whatever a child needs that a mother working under a false name, struggling to make ends meet, might not always be able to provide." His voice roughened. "I told myself it wasn't control. I told myself it was the only love I was allowed to give from a distance. The only way I could be a father to a son I wasn't permitted to see. I have never once used it to trace you, Elena. I swear that to you on everything I have left. I couldn't stand the thought of him going without, while I sat in a penthouse worth more than most people see in a lifetime. I couldn't live with that. So I found a way to give without taking, the only way I knew how." Elena's legs gave out beneath her, and she sank into the chair she'd refused a moment earlier, hands pressed over her mouth. 5 years of carefully constructed anger crumbling into something far more disorienting. She remembered the winter the restaurant chain had cut her hours, the month she'd been terrified she wouldn't make rent, and then, mysteriously, impossibly, an extra deposit had appeared in her account that she'd never been able to explain, that she'd told herself was some clerical error she was too afraid to question in case questioning made it disappear.
It hadn't been an error. It had been him. All along, it had been him. "You told me you didn't know where I was," she whispered. "I didn't lie about that after the first 4 months. I made the firm burn the records once the account was established. I never let myself know your exact address, because I didn't trust myself not to show up on your doorstep and beg you to come home. And I was terrified that showing up would be the thing that finally made you disappear for good, somewhere I could never follow." His voice broke, finally, on the last word. "I have spent 5 years loving you from exactly as far away as I could stand it, Elena, because it was the only kind of love I thought you'd allow me to give." The woman who had spent 5 years believing herself abandoned by the man in front of her felt the entire architecture of her grief buckle and reform into something new. Not less painful, but differently shaped. The specific grief of realizing that the villain she'd built in her mind had, in fact, been standing guard over her from the shadows the whole time, silent and unacknowledged and utterly, hopelessly in love. She was crying before she understood she'd started. "You should have told me." "Would you have believed me?" She didn't have an answer for that, because she wasn't certain, 5 years ago, frightened and freshly betrayed by a lie she'd never been given the chance to verify, that she would have believed anything Damien Rossi told her. "I believe you now," she said instead, and it was the truest thing she'd said to him in 5 years. Damien crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair, taking both her hands in his, and for the first time since the pharmacy, since the rain, since the necklace and the count of days, Elena let herself lean forward and press her forehead to his without reservation, without the careful architecture that had held her heart at a safe distance for 5 long years. "I hated you," she whispered. "For 5 years I hated you, and I think some part of me hated you because it hurt less than missing you." "I know." His hands tightened around hers. "I would rather you hated me and stayed safe than loved me and stayed in danger. I have made my peace with being the villain of your story, Elena, if it meant you and Matteo lived long enough to write a better one." "You're not the villain," she said, and meant it, fully, for the first time. "You never were. I just needed someone to blame for how much it hurt." Outside the study window, the city glittered on, indifferent to the quiet collapse of 5 years of carefully maintained anger. And somewhere in that glittering dark, a man named Nikolai Volkov was already making the calls that would bring the fragile peace of the penthouse crashing down around all of them. The days after the trust fund revelation moved differently than any that had come before. Something had shifted between them, not resolved, not entirely healed. 5 years of hurt didn't dissolve in a single confession, but altered fundamentally, the way a fracture heals crooked, but heals nonetheless. Elena found herself watching Damien with new eyes, seeing beneath the cold precision of the boss to the desperate, careful love of the man who had spent half a decade protecting her from a distance he'd imposed on himself as penance for a crime he hadn't actually committed. "I need to tell you something else," Damien said one evening, the two of them alone on the terrace after Matteo had gone to bed. The same terrace where she'd painted herb boxes a lifetime ago. "About the day you left." Elena's stomach tightened. "What else is there?" "I know who told you I'd use him as leverage." Damien's jaw was tight. It wasn't a lie exactly. It was a truth twisted into a weapon. My father, before he died, had discussed exactly that scenario, using a future heir as insurance against rival families, the way our family had always operated for 3 generations before me. I heard him say it once, in front of some of his oldest men, when I was young enough to think it was simply how the world worked. He looked out over the river. One of those men repeated it to you, made it sound like my plan, not my father's ghost. I never got the chance to tell you I'd spent years trying to build something different from what he built. I never got the chance to prove it because you were already gone before I understood what had been said to you. Who told me? Elena's voice had gone quiet, cold in a way that surprised even her. I don't know for certain. Vincent suspects it may connect to the same rot that led us to Volkov's informant. I intend to find out. His hand found hers on the terrace railing. But I need you to know, Elena, whatever I inherited from my father, I have spent every day since his death trying to become someone he wouldn't recognize. Someone who could be trusted with a child. I don't know if I've succeeded. I only know I've tried. Elena studied his profile in the dim terrace light. The same face she'd fallen in love with 5 years ago, harder now, older, marked by grief he'd carried alone. I think, she said slowly, that I've spent 5 years punishing you for a sentence someone else said that you never actually meant. You couldn't have known that. No, but I could have asked. I could have given you the chance to explain before I ran. Her voice thickened. I was so afraid of becoming my mother, a woman who stayed with a dangerous man because she loved him and paid for it eventually with everything, that I ran from the possibility of becoming her instead of finding out whether you were actually anything like the man I feared. You were protecting your son. Damien's hand tightened around hers. I will never fault you for that, Elena. Not once, not ever. A mother who runs to protect her child isn't a coward. She's the bravest person in any room she walks into. Something in Elena broke open at that. Not painfully, not this time, but like a wound finally allowed to breathe. She turned into him before she'd consciously decided to, and his arms came around her instantly, 5 years of careful distance collapsing into the kind of embrace that asked for nothing and offered everything. I don't know how to do this, she admitted into his shoulder. I don't know how to trust something this big again. Then don't do it all at once. His hand moved slowly over her hair, the gesture so tender it ached. Do it one day at a time, the way you've survived everything else. I'm not going anywhere, Elena. I told Matteo that over his shoelaces, and I meant it for you too. I'm not going anywhere, no matter how long it takes you to believe it. Above them, the city's lights blurred into something like stars, and for the first time in 5 years, Eleanor let herself imagine a future that didn't require running. A future built not on the absence of danger, because danger, she understood now, would always circle a man like Damien Rossi, but on the presence of someone willing to stand in it with her, instead of leaving her to face it alone. It wasn't safety. It was better than safety. It was choice. The call came 4 days later. Vincent's face, when he entered the study, told Damien everything before a single word was spoken. Volkov's making his move, Vincent said. Tomorrow night. He's assembling everyone he has at the East River warehouse, and our informant inside his organization says he intends to strike the penthouse directly, not with subtlety this time, with force. Then we strike first. Damien's voice had gone to the flat, absolute register Elena recognized from months of proximity. The voice of the man who ruled, instead of the man who made pancakes. "Assemble everyone. I want Volkov's operation ended before he ever gets near this building." Vincent nodded and left, and the study fell into a silence that felt like the moment before a held note finally breaks. "You could die tomorrow," Elena said. She hadn't meant to say it aloud. It came out anyway, raw and unguarded. "I could." Damien didn't soften it, didn't offer false comfort, and she loved him a little more for the honesty, even as it terrified her. "Men in my position always could. I made peace with that a long time ago, before you, before Matteo. I'm less at peace with it now, because now I have more to lose than I've ever had in my life." Elena crossed the room and stood in front of him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off him, close enough that neither of them could pretend the distance between them was anything but a choice. "I need to say something," Damien said, and his voice, for the first time since she'd known him, since the very first year, long before the pharmacy, long before the necklace, shook with something that wasn't anger or grief, but a kind of terrified honesty. He knelt. Elena's breath caught. Damien Rossi, who had never bent his knee to another living soul, who commanded fear and loyalty in equal measure from men who would have died rather than see him vulnerable, knelt in front of her, in the middle of his own study, with his eyes wet and his jaw tight with the effort of saying words he'd carried unspoken for 5 years. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," he said, voice low and unsteady. "I don't think I've earned it yet. And I don't think one confession undoes 5 years of silence, however good my reasons were. I'm not asking you to marry me, or promise me forever, or tell me you love me back. Though God help me, Elena, I hope someday you will." He took her hands in both of his, and she felt them trembling. "I just need you to know, before I walk into whatever tomorrow brings, if I die tonight or tomorrow or any night after this, my heart has belonged to you since the very first summer, since before either of us understood what we were building, and it has never once, not for a single day of the 5 years I spent looking for you, belonged to anyone else. It never will. Whatever happens to me, I needed you to have that, not as a burden, as a fact you can carry however you choose." Elena was crying before he finished, and she didn't try to stop it, didn't try to hide it the way she'd hidden everything for 5 years. She sank to her knees in front of him, meeting him at eye level, and framed his face with both hands. "I don't want your confession as a goodbye," she said, voice thick. "I want it as a beginning. Do you understand me, Damien? You are not walking into that warehouse tomorrow to die nobly and leave me a memory to carry. You are walking in to survive it, and you are coming home to me and to our son, and then you are going to spend the rest of your life proving that what you just said is true, one ordinary morning at a time, the way you've been trying to prove it, with pancakes and shoelaces and a nightlight in the shape of a lighthouse." A sound broke out of him that was half laugh, half sob, entirely undone. "That's not asking for much. It's asking for everything." Her thumb traced his cheekbone. "It's asking for you to choose to survive, Damien. For us. Can you do that?" "I have never wanted to survive anything more in my entire life," he said. And then he kissed her. It wasn't careful. It wasn't the tentative reunion of two people testing whether the ground beneath them would hold. It was 5 years of grief and longing and fear and love, all of it breaking loose at once. And Elena met it with everything she had, both of them kneeling on the floor of a study that had witnessed 100 cold, calculated business decisions and had never once, until that night, witnessed anything so entirely, helplessly human. When they finally rose, hands still tangled together, Damien looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been handed a reason to survive a war he'd already half resigned himself to losing. "Stay with me tonight," he said. "Not because tomorrow might be the end, because I don't want to spend one more night in that room alone when you're finally close enough to reach." Elena didn't answer with words. She laced her fingers through his and led the way down the hallway herself, past the third bedroom where their son slept soundly, unaware that his parents were, at last, choosing each other without reservation, without the careful architecture of self-protection either of them had spent 5 years building. The war would come tomorrow. Tonight belonged only to them. Some things, Elena would think later, the body never forgets, no matter how many years or oceans or false names come between the last time and the next. Damien's hands remembered the exact curve of her waist. Her mouth remembered the particular way his breath caught when she kissed the hinge of his jaw. 5 years dissolved in the dark of his bedroom, the way morning fog dissolves against sunlight, not instantly, but completely, until nothing remained of the distance they'd both spent half a decade constructing. "I missed this," Damien murmured against her collarbone, his voice wrecked, reverent. "I missed you, every part of you. I told myself I'd forgotten, that time would dull it, and it never did, not once." "Show me," Elena whispered. And he did, slowly, thoroughly, with the desperate tenderness of a man who understood that tomorrow held no guarantees and was determined to memorize every inch of tonight in case it was the only night he ever got. There was nothing careful about it, in the end, despite how carefully it began. Desperation and desire and 5 years of grief tangled together until neither of them could separate love from mourning, from the fierce, unrelenting need to simply be close to another person who understood exactly what had been lost and exactly what might still be saved. Damien said her name like a vow between every gasping breath. Elena held on to him like a woman holding on to the one solid thing in a world determined to wash everything else away. Afterward, tangled together in sheets that smelled like him, like home, like a life she'd once been terrified to want, Elena traced the necklace resting against his collarbone, twin to the one she still wore, the one she'd never been able to make herself remove, even during the years she told herself she hated him. "You kept it," she said, "every night. I never took it off until the day you disappeared, and I put it back on the night I saw you again." His fingers found hers, tangled them together against his chest. "I think some part of me always knew I'd need it again someday. Hope, apparently, doesn't require permission to persist." "I kept mine too." She lifted the small gold chain at her own throat. "I told myself it was a mistake, forgetting to throw it away. It wasn't a mistake. I just couldn't do it." "I'm glad." He pressed a kiss to her temple, unhurried, the kind of kiss that belonged to a man who believed, at least for tonight, that he had all the time in the world. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Elena, I need you to know this wasn't goodbye. This was the beginning I should have gotten 5 years ago, if the world had been kinder to both of us." The world was never going to be kind to people like us, Eleanor said quietly. I think I understood that even before I ran. I just thought running would let me build something the world couldn't touch. Did it work? She considered the question honestly, the way she hadn't let herself consider anything in 5 years of forward motion, always running, never looking back long enough to assess the cost. No, she admitted. It kept him safe. It didn't keep either of us whole. I don't think safety and wholeness are the same thing, Damien. I spent 5 years thinking they were. What are they then, if not the same thing? Safety is walls. Her fingers traced idle patterns against his chest, over his heart, feeling it beat steady beneath her palm. Wholeness is this, choosing to stand in the open, with someone, even when the open is dangerous. I think I finally understand the difference. Damien didn't answer with words. He simply pulled her closer, tucking her head beneath his chin, the way he had, apparently, memorized doing 5 years ago, and never forgotten. And for a few hours, in the dark of a penthouse bedroom, with a war waiting outside the window, two people who had spent 5 years surviving separately finally allowed themselves to simply exist together, unguarded, unafraid, choosing each other with the particular fierce tenderness of people who understood exactly how much choosing each other might cost. Neither of them slept much. Neither of them needed to. Some nights aren't for rest. Some nights are simply for being present, fully, entirely, for however long the world allows it. By the time grey dawn crept over the river, they were still tangled together, still awake, and Damien pressed one last kiss to her temple before rising to prepare for the war both of them knew was coming. "Whatever happens today," he said, dressing in the pale light, "last night happened. Nothing that comes after can take that away from us." Elena watched him fasten the necklace at his throat with hands that for the first time she'd ever witnessed trembled slightly. "Come back to me," she said. "That's all I want from today. Everything else we'll figure out together." "I intend to," Damien said, and kissed her once more, fierce and certain, before walking out to face a war for the family he'd nearly lost the chance to have. The East River warehouse burned orange against the pre-dawn dark, lit by the headlights of a dozen vehicles Damien's men had positioned in a wide, silent perimeter. Damien stood at the centre of it, Vincent at his shoulder, watching the building where Nikolai Volkov had gathered the bulk of his enforcers, unaware, or so Damien's informant claimed, that the strike he'd planned for that night was about to be preempted by ours. "Everyone in position?" Damien's voice was flat, controlled, the voice of the boss entirely now, the father and lover folded away into some private compartment for the duration of what was about to happen. "In position," Vincent confirmed. "On your word." Damien's word came a moment later, quiet, absolute, and the warehouse erupted into controlled chaos, his men moving in coordinated waves, breaching points calculated with military precision, the specific, brutal efficiency of an organization that had spent decades perfecting the art of ending conflicts quickly and completely. It was not clean. War, Damien had learned long ago, never was. But it was fast and it was decisive. And within 40 minutes, Volkov's operation lay in ruins around him. Enforcers captured or scattered, weapons confiscated, the specific silence of an organization that had just lost its teeth settling over the warehouse floor. Volkov himself was found in a back office, calm despite the chaos outside, pouring himself a drink with the unbothered ease of a man who had planned for every contingency except the one currently unfolding. Rossi. Volkov didn't rise. I underestimated how quickly love would make you reckless. You underestimated how quickly love would make me thorough. Damien's voice carried no heat, which somehow made it more frightening than rage would have. You touched something that belongs to me, my territory, my family, my son. I want you to understand, before this ends, that there was never a version of this where you walked away untouched. Everyone always says that. Volkov set down his glass. And yet here we both are, still breathing, still talking. Perhaps you're not as thorough as you believe. The night isn't over. Damien's eyes were cold, and I have not decided yet whether you leave this building breathing. That decision depends entirely on how forthcoming you're willing to be about who inside my own organization has been feeding you information for the better part of a year. Volkov's smile flickered just slightly, just enough to confirm what Vincent's suspicions had already suggested, that there was more rot in the foundation than a single low-level informant, that the leak ran deeper and closer than anyone had yet uncovered. You'll find out soon enough, Volkov said. Some secrets are more valuable kept than told, even under duress. I suspect you'll discover this one at the worst possible moment, Rossi. That's usually how these things go. Damien's jaw tightened. But before he could press further, his phone rang. Vincent's second, a man stationed at the penthouse, and something in the tone of the ringtone, the specific urgency of a call marked for genuine emergencies only, sent ice down Damien's spine before he even answered. Report, he said, voice suddenly sharp. The voice on the other end was breathless, frightened, the words tumbling out too fast. Damien's face drained of colour in real time, and Vincent, watching, felt his own stomach drop before he'd even heard the words himself. What is it? Vincent asked, low. Damien lowered the phone slowly, and when he looked up, the expression on his face was one Vincent had never seen there before. Not in 20 years of friendship, not through every war and betrayal and loss they'd survived together. Matteo's gone, Damien said. Someone took him from the penthouse 20 minutes ago. Elena's alive. She's hurt, but she's alive. His voice cracked on the next words. And Vincent. She says the man who took him wasn't working for Volkov at all. Behind him, in the ruined office, Nikolai Volkov began, very softly, to laugh. Elena's head throbbed where she'd been struck, a graze along her temple that had already begun to swell, but the pain was nothing, nothing at all, compared to the hollow, screaming absence in the penthouse where her son should have been. Damien arrived within 15 minutes, moving through the front door like something unleashed, and found her in the hallway outside Matteo's room, on her knees amid overturned furniture, blood matting her hair, her hands shaking too badly to hold the phone she'd used to call for help. Elena. He dropped to the floor in front of her, hands framing her face, checking the wound with the desperate thoroughness of a man cataloguing every possible injury before allowing himself to feel anything else. Talk to me. What happened? 2 men. Her voice was hoarse, wrecked. They came through the service entrance, the one only staff use. They knew the codes, Damien. They knew exactly where his room was, exactly when the guards changed shifts. Someone gave them everything. Damien's face went rigid. Someone inside. There's more. Eleanor grabbed his wrist, her grip fierce, despite the tremor running through her whole body. Damien,
I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything, because it changes everything about who might have taken him and why. Elena, whatever it is, my father wasn't just some man who abandoned us. The words came fast now, 5 years of secrecy breaking apart at once. My mother never told you my full history because I never let her, because I spent my whole life running from it, the same way I ran from you. My father is Alexander Marchetti. He led the Marchetti crime family out of Boston for almost 20 years before he went underground. He's not dead, Damien. He disappeared the same way I did, and he's been hiding his identity ever since. A war with the Calabrettis nearly destroyed everything he built. Her eyes were wet, desperate. The Marchetti family was Rossi's rival for 3 generations before either of us was born. I'm not just some woman you fell in love with. I'm the daughter of a man your father tried to destroy. Matteo isn't just your heir. He's the convergence of 2 bloodlines that were sworn enemies before either of us existed. Damien went very still, the pieces of the last several days rearranging themselves violently in his mind. The informant's silence about who else had known, Volkov's knowing laugh, the specificity of the men who'd known the service codes and the guard rotations. Someone didn't take him for Volkov, Damien said slowly, understanding dawning with a horror that felt like ice water in his veins. Someone took him, because he's the missing piece in a war between 2 families that never actually ended. Someone who wants to use him against both sides at once. My father, Elena whispered. If he's resurfaced, if he's the one behind this. Or someone using his name, someone who knows enough of the old history to weaponize it. Damien rose, pulling her up with him, his mind already moving through every contact, every resource, every threat he'd catalogued over 2 decades running an empire built on knowing exactly who wanted him dead and why. We need Vincent, now. And Elena? I need every detail you've never told me, every name, every location, anything from your father's history that might tell us where he'd take a child he considers a weapon in a war he never finished. Elena's hands were still shaking, blood drying at her temple, but her voice, when it came, had steadied into something hard and determined. The voice of a woman who had spent 5 years running from her past and understood, finally, that the only way to save her son was to stop running and face it head-on. I'll tell you everything, she said, but Damien, whatever we find, whatever this costs, we get him back. Both of us, together. I am done letting anyone decide my son's fate but the people who actually love him. Damien pulled her against his chest, one hand cradling the back of her head, careful of the wound, and for a moment neither of them spoke, both of them absorbing the full weight of what they were about to face. A war between bloodlines neither of them had chosen, converging on the one small, innocent life that mattered more than either empire ever had. Together, Damien agreed, voice rough. We end this together, or we don't end it at all. The trail led 12 hours later to a shipping facility on the Boston waterfront, one of the few properties Vincent's investigators discovered still quietly held under a shell company tied to the Marchetti name from decades earlier, dormant for years, reactivated only within the last month. He's been planning this for weeks, Damien said, studying the surveillance photos Vincent had assembled, his voice tight with barely contained fury. Since before Volkov ever made his move.
Volkov was noise, Elena, a distraction we walked straight into while your father built the real trap underneath it. Elena stood at the window of the command vehicle, arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the grey Boston skyline with the particular numbness of a woman confronting a ghost she'd spent her entire childhood being warned about and had never fully believed was real. "I don't even know if it's really him," she admitted. "I was 12 when he disappeared. I remember a man who terrified everyone in every room he entered, whom my mother cried about at night, who I promised myself I would never become anything like. If he's alive, if he's really the one who took Matteo, then we end whatever this is the same way I ended Volkov's operation this morning." Damien's voice left no room for doubt. Completely. "He's still my father, Damien. And Matteo is still your son. I understand the weight of what I'm asking, Elena, better than most men could. But I will not negotiate with anyone who put a hand on that child, blood or not, ghost or not. I need you to be certain you understand that before we walk into whatever's waiting in that facility." Elena's jaw tightened, and when she turned to face him, something had hardened in her expression that Damien recognized instantly, because he'd seen its twin in his own mirror 100 times. The specific resolve of a person who had decided, finally and completely, which battle mattered more than every loyalty that came before it. "I understand," she said. "He made his choice when he took my son. Whatever he is to me, he's an enemy to Matteo. I know which side I'm standing on." They breached the facility an hour after nightfall, Damien's men moving with the same brutal precision they'd shown at Volkov's warehouse, and this time Elena insisted on entering with them, over every objection Damien raised, because she understood something none of his men could. The specific voice, the specific mannerisms, the specific weaknesses of a man she'd spent 12 childhood years learning to survive. They found Matteo in a back office, frightened but unharmed, sitting on a metal folding chair, while an old man in an expensive but outdated suit watched him with an expression Elena couldn't immediately pass. Not cruelty exactly, but something colder, more calculating. The look of a man assessing an asset rather than a grandchild. "Elena," Alexander Marchetti rose slowly, his voice carrying the particular gravel of a man who'd spent decades having every word obeyed instantly. "You've grown into your mother's face. A pity you didn't inherit her patience along with it." "Let him go." Elena's voice didn't shake, though everything inside her did. "Whatever this is, whatever point you're trying to make, he's 5 years old. He has nothing to do with whatever war you never finished." "He has everything to do with it." Alexander's eyes moved to Damien, standing tense and lethal in the doorway, weapon lowered but ready. "That boy carries Marchetti blood and Rossi blood in the same body. Do you understand what that means, Elena? For 30 years, our families destroyed each other over territory, over pride, over the small idiocies men mistake for honor. And now, by accident, by the simple stupidity of 2 young people falling in love without asking permission from history, you've created something neither family ever managed on purpose. A bridge. A single life that could end the war entirely or reignite it worse than it's ever burned, depending on who controls him." "Nobody controls him," Damien said, voice like iron. "He's a child, not a symbol, not a weapon, a child." Spoken like a man who's never had to think in generations. Alexander's smile was thin, humorless. "I didn't take him to harm him, Rossi. I took him to force this conversation. The one neither of you would have without a gun to somebody's head. I want a treaty. Marchetti and Rossi, ended as enemies, formalized as allies, sealed by the blood already running through my grandson's veins, whether either of you asked for it or not. The room went silent. The weight of 30 years of inherited hatred and one small, frightened boy's future balanced on a single decision. You could have simply asked, Damien said finally, each word measured, controlled, though Elena could see the fury banked just beneath the surface of his composure. You didn't need to terrify a child to negotiate a treaty. I've watched men negotiate in good faith for 30 years, Rossi. It rarely produces results as fast as fear does. Alexander's gaze didn't waver. You have every reason to hate me for this method. I don't ask you to forgive it. I ask you to consider the outcome, regardless of the path that led here. Papa? Matteo's small voice cut through the tension, confused, frightened, reaching instinctively for the parent he trusted. Elena crossed the room in 3 strides and gathered him into her arms, and something in Alexander's carefully composed face flickered at the sight. Grief, perhaps, or regret, or the specific ache of a man watching a life he'd forfeited long ago play out in front of him without permission to touch it. It's all right, baby. Elena pressed her lips to her son's hair, feeling him shake against her, feeling her own hands shake in answer. Mama's here. Papa's here. Nobody is taking you anywhere. Damien's eyes moved from his son, safe now in Elena's arms, to the old man standing across the room, and something in his expression shifted. The calculation of a boss weighing a threat, transforming, slowly, into the calculation of a man considering an offer that might, despite everything, actually serve the family he was trying to build. Say I consider this, Damien said slowly. Say I consider ending 30 years of war between our families, formalized, real, not just a ceasefire waiting to break. What do you actually want, Alexander? Men like you don't resurface after decades in hiding for sentiment alone. I want to see my grandson grow up in a world that isn't trying to kill him for an accident of birth he never asked for. For the first time, something genuine cracked through Alexander's composure, an old man's grief, long buried, surfacing despite himself. I have spent 20 years hiding from a war I started, watching from a distance while my daughter ran from the very name I gave her, unable to reach out without dragging her back into the danger I created. When I learned about the boy, when I understood what he represented, I saw for the first time in decades a way to end what I began, instead of simply hiding from its consequences until I die. You could have called, Elena said, voice raw. You could have written. You could have done anything other than terrify a 5-year-old to make your point. I know. Alexander's voice, for the first time, sounded genuinely old, genuinely tired. I have made many choices in my life I am not proud of, Elena. This may be the last one I get to make. I wanted it to matter. The room held its breath. War and grief and the fragile possibility of peace all balanced on a single decision that belonged, in the end, only to Damien. Here are my terms, Damien said finally. You disappear again, permanently this time, with no further contact unless Elena chooses it, on her terms, in her time. Whatever treaty exists between Marchetti and Rossi exists because I choose to end this war for my son's sake, not because you forced my hand today. And if you ever come near my family again without an invitation, old man, blood or not, history or not, I will finish what my father started 30 years ago, and I will not hesitate the way you apparently believe I might." Alexander studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, slow, final. "Fair terms. Better than I deserve." His eyes moved to Elena, to Matteo still clutched safely in her arms. "I am sorry, Elena, for all of it. For the war, for the running, for a childhood you should never have had to survive. I don't ask you to forgive me. I only ask you to let him grow up better than either of us managed." "He will," Elena said, quiet, absolute. "Because we are going to make sure of it. Both of us." Alexander left without another word, disappearing back into whatever shadow he'd emerged from, and the war that had shaped 3 generations of 2 families finally, formally, ended. Not with triumph, but with the particular exhausted relief of people who had simply grown tired of losing what mattered most to a fight none of them had chosen to start. They flew back to New York in silence, Matteo asleep between them, one small hand fisted in his mother's sleeve and the other resting unconsciously against his father's arm, as if, even in sleep, some instinct in him understood he needed to be touching both of them at once to feel safe. Damien watched his son's face in the dim cabin light and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for 5 years. Not resolution, exactly. The danger wasn't entirely gone. Danger never entirely left men like him. But a kind of clarity he hadn't allowed himself in longer than he could remember. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, once they'd landed and Matteo had been carried, still sleeping, to the car by one of the men Damien trusted most. "What is it?" Elena's voice was tired, worn thin by the last 2 days, but steady. "I've spent 20 years building an empire on the theory that power keeps the people you love safe." Damien's eyes stayed on the car ahead, on the small shape of his son's sleeping form visible through the window. "Today, I watched my son get taken anyway, despite every guard, every wall, every resource I've spent 2 decades accumulating. Power didn't save him, Elena. You did. Your history did. The truth, finally spoken instead of hidden, did." He turned to face her fully. "I think I've been building the wrong thing all this time." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want this life for him anymore." Damien's voice was quiet, certain, the voice of a man who had finally arrived at a decision he'd been circling for longer than he'd admitted to himself. "I don't want Matteo to grow up counting guards instead of counting sheep. I don't want him inheriting an empire that requires him to spend his childhood as a target simply for existing. I built all of this because I believed power was the only currency that could keep the people I loved from disappearing. I was wrong. It just gives more people more reasons to try to take them." Elena studied his face in the dim light of the car, searching for the catch, the condition, the version of this decision that still left room for the boss she'd known 5 years ago. She didn't find one. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to hand it over." Damien's jaw was set, but his voice carried no hesitation. "Vincent has earned it 20 times over. He's been loyal to me since we were both boys with nothing, and he'll run the family better than I ever did, because he'll run it without a child's safety hanging in the balance of every decision." "I'm done, Eleanor. Not tomorrow, not after one more war. Now. Tonight, if Vincent will have it. Damien! Eleanor's voice caught. That's everything you've built. Everything your family has been for 3 generations. It's an empire built on my father's fear and my own grief. Damien took her hand, held it against his chest, the necklace at his throat catching the streetlight the way it had the night everything began again in the rain. I want to build something different now, something smaller, something that doesn't require an army to protect, because it isn't a target for anyone anymore. I want to be a father who teaches his son to tie his shoes because he loves him, not because he's terrified every ordinary moment might be the last one they share. I want to be a man for you, Elena, not a boss you have to negotiate with, not a legend you have to be afraid of. Just a man, if you'll still have one. Elena's eyes filled, and this time she didn't try to hide it, didn't try to be strong in the specific way she'd taught herself to be strong for 5 long years of running. I've never wanted the boss, she said, voice breaking. I've only ever wanted the man who made giraffe pancakes and knelt on a study floor and told me the truth even when it cost him everything. I've wanted that man since the first summer, Damien. I never stopped. He kissed her then, in the back of a car, with their sleeping son visible through the window ahead of them, and it tasted like relief, like grief finally allowed to become something gentler, like the specific, particular joy of 2 people choosing, at last, a future neither of them had believed themselves allowed to want. Vincent, when Damien called him that same night, was silent for a long moment on the other end of the line, long enough that Damien wondered if the connection had dropped. "You're certain?" Vincent said finally. It wasn't really a question. 20 years of friendship had taught him to recognize when Damien had already crossed the threshold of a decision and was simply extending the courtesy of announcing it. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Damien said. "You've earned this 100 times over, Vincent. You held this family together through wars I started and grief I couldn't manage. I trust you with it more than I ever trusted myself. And if the other families see this as weakness, a boss stepping down in the middle of a fragile peace, then let them test it." Damien's voice was calm, the calm of a man who had already made his peace with whatever price this decision might carry. "You're not weak, Vincent. You never have been. You'll run this family better than I did, because you won't be running from a 5-year grief every time you make a decision. I want to build something different now, something my son never has to inherit unless he chooses it freely, as a man, not as a birthright soaked in other men's blood. Your father would call this a betrayal of everything he built." "My father built an empire on fear and buried himself in it long before he actually died." Damien looked toward the window, where Elena sat with Matteo's sleeping head in her lap, her fingers combing gently through his dark hair. "I'm not interested in finishing his legacy, Vincent. I'm interested in starting my own, and mine doesn't require a throne." There was a long pause, and then quietly, Vincent said the thing Damien hadn't realized he needed to hear until it was said. "Then go be a father, Damien. I've got this. I've had your back for 20 years. I'm not about to stop now, whether you're standing behind the throne or walking away from it." The papers were signed within the week, quietly, without ceremony, beyond the small circle of men who had earned the right to witness it, and Damian Rossi,
once the most feared name in 3 boroughs, a man whose voice alone could end arguments before they began, walked out of the only life he had ever known and did not look back once. 6 months later, the penthouse belonged to Vincent. Damian had signed the transfer papers himself, in a quiet ceremony attended only by the family's oldest lieutenants, men who had wept actual tears watching the boss who had led them through a decade of wars step down not in defeat, but in something that looked unmistakably like peace. Damien, Elena and Matteo lived now in a house on the Hudson, modest by the standards of the empire Damien had once ruled, extraordinary by any measure that actually mattered. A yard where Matteo could run without a guard's silhouette darkening every window. A kitchen where Damien still made giraffe pancakes every Sunday. A bedroom where Elena slept every night beside a man who no longer counted days spent apart because there weren't any left to count. On a bright Saturday morning in early spring, Elena stood at the kitchen window and watched Damien teach their son to ride a bicycle in the yard. One hand steady on the seat, the other gesturing encouragement. Both of them laughing at Matteo's wobbling, determined progress across the grass. "He's got it!" Damon called back towards the house, releasing the seat, and Matteo pedalled 3 full, triumphant yards before tumbling gently into the grass, laughing too hard to be hurt, and Damien dropped down beside him, checking him over with the same careful reverence he'd shown that very first night in the rain, 5 years and a lifetime ago. Elena walked out onto the porch, coffee in hand, and Damien looked up and found her there the way he always did now, not searching, not counting, just looking, the way a man looks at something he no longer fears losing. "Come here," he said, "both of you. I want to show you something." He led them around the side of the house to a small garden he'd been building in secret for weeks, refusing to let either of them see it until it was finished. A modest plot of herb boxes, the wood painted the exact shade of blue Elena had chosen for the terrace garden a lifetime ago. Before everything fell apart. Before everything, eventually, came back together stronger for having broken. "I remembered," he said quietly, watching her face as she took it in. "The colour. I know it's not the same terrace. I know we can't get those years back. But I wanted you to have something that was ours again, from the beginning, before either of us understood what we were building or what it might cost." Elena's eyes filled, and she didn't try to stop it, didn't try to be anything other than exactly what she felt. A woman, standing in sunlight, with a man she'd once believed she'd lost forever. A son laughing beside them. A garden growing where grief used to live.
"I used to be the boss of darkness," Damien said, taking her hand.
His voice steady in a way it had never quite managed to be during all those years of shadows and counted days. "I ruled through fear, because I believed fear was the only thing strong enough to keep the people I loved alive. I was wrong about almost everything that mattered, Elena. But I was never wrong about you. Now I don't want the Empire. I don't want the darkness. I just want to be a father to our son, and a man for you. An ordinary man, in an ordinary garden, standing in the sunlight, instead of hiding from it." Matteo, unaware of the weight of the moment, tugged at both their hands. "Can we plant something? I want tomatoes. Papa says tomatoes are the best." "Tomatoes," Damien agreed, laughing, the sound easy and unguarded, in a way Elena had only begun hearing from him in these last 6 months of ordinary mornings.
Whatever you want, mio piccolo. We have all the time in the world now. Elena looked at the two of them, father and son, dark heads bent together over a patch of turned earth, planning a garden instead of a war, and felt the last of the old grief finally settle into something like peace. Not because the danger was entirely gone. Danger never entirely left people who had lived the lives they'd lived, but because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't facing it alone, wasn't running, wasn't hiding in small rooms under names that weren't hers. She was standing in the sunlight, hand in hand with a man who had once counted every day of her absence and now, finally, got to simply exist beside her instead. Ordinary, unguarded, entirely, permanently home. "I love you," she said, the words easy now, no longer costing either of them anything they weren't glad to spend. "I should have said it the first summer. I'm saying it now instead, every day, for as long as you'll let me." "Every day," Damien agreed, pulling her close, their son's laughter rising bright and unbothered into the clear spring air around them. "For the rest of our lives. I'm done counting the days we lose, Elena. From here on, I only want to count the ones we get to keep." Later that afternoon, while Matteo napped exhausted in the grass beneath the kitchen window, worn out from bicycles and tomato planting, and the particular joy of a boy who had spent his whole short life half aware that something enormous had once threatened to take his parents from him, Elena sat beside Damien on the porch steps and watched the light change over the water. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The power, the fear people used to have when you walked into a room?" Damien considered the question honestly, turning it over the way he turned over every question now, slowly, without the old urgency that used to colour every decision he made. "Sometimes I miss the certainty of it," he admitted. "Fear is simple, Elena. It tells you exactly where you stand with people. This," he gestured at the garden, the yard, the sleeping boy, the woman beside him. "This is harder. Love doesn't come with guarantees the way fear does. I have to choose it new every single morning, without the old architecture of control to fall back on when I'm afraid." "Is that so terrible?" "No." He took her hand, turned it over, pressed a kiss to her palm the way he used to do in the very first summer, before either of them understood what they were building or what it would eventually cost them both. "It's the best kind of terrifying I've ever known. I'll take it over the old certainty every day for the rest of my life." They sat together as the sun dropped lower over the Hudson, gilding the water gold, and somewhere behind them, their son stirred in his sleep and murmured something about tomatoes, and neither of them moved to wake him, content simply to sit in the quiet, ordinary miracle of an afternoon, with nothing left to survive. Vincent called once a month, always briefly, always careful never to bring the old world too close to the new one Damien had built. The families, as far as anyone could tell, had settled into an uneasy but durable peace. Alexander Marchetti's treaty holding, more or less under Vincent's steady leadership, the old grudges between Rossi and Marchetti finally allowed to rest in the ground where they belonged. Occasionally, a photograph would surface online, some grainy image of an old man in an unremarkable coat feeding pigeons in a park in Lisbon or Prague. Never confirmed, never pursued. Elena let those sightings pass through her without taking root. Some ghosts, she had learned, only had power over you if you kept turning around to look at them. In the evenings, when Matteo was finally down for the night and the house had gone quiet around them, Damien would sometimes find Elena in the small garden, kneeling in the dirt in the last of the daylight, tending the herb boxes the way she had 5 years before this, and before that, in a life that felt now like it belonged to two entirely different people, learning, slowly, painfully, how to become the ones who finally got to stay. He would kneel beside her without a word, hands in the same soil, and for a long while neither of them would speak, because some things, the important things, the things that had cost them 5 years and a war and a broken family history to finally earn, didn't need saying any more. They had already said everything that mattered. Now there was only the living of it. Ordinary day after ordinary day, in the sunlight, together, for as long as they both were given. Above them, the sun climbed higher over the Hudson, warm and unguarded and entirely without shadow. And for the first time in 5 years, neither of them looked back to check what might be following. There was nothing left to fear. There was only the garden, the boy, and the man who had finally chosen, after a lifetime in the dark, to stand in the light.